and with the back room, and I think Danny Field says it very, very well about that. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about, although with Andy it was about money. I mean, he never picked up a check in his life. Mm-hmm. And Mickey Ruskin, you know, when Mickey Ruskin died, they found all these bills that all of us owed him, including myself. You know, he just would write it off, and write it off. So you had Max's Kansas City, and people used to say, for example, like Andy wasn't political, and these artists were not political. But I will tell you that I could go into Max, and I was sort of like one foot in the political world and one foot in the Dan Flavin lighting of the back room of Max's Kansas City, and I would bring in political things, and I had the communications company, which was this little one sheet that we would pass around, and it would bring people up to date about the politics. But when the Living Theater got busted and we needed to get money for the Living Theater to get out of jail, Andy gave me not cash, he gave me a painting. You know, Robert Indiana would give you a painting. Robert Rauschenberg. These are also the closeted gay artists at that time who became world famous later. But they were involved. They just weren't involved in the way that I was. And there was this linkage. And I just want to make it clear that for all the decadence that people say about this scene, and there certainly was that element of it, I always found that the people there, from Mickey Ruskin to Andy to Robert Indiana to Rauschenberg to Jasper Johns to, you know, Frosty Myers, all of those people would always be willing to do something for it. And then one of the great events of the 60s, which has not been written enough about, is the artist's response to the Vietnam War, which took place at the courthouse down on 2nd Avenue and 2nd Street, which is now the Anthology Theater. There was an on-site installation with multiple rooms. It was a former jailhouse and courthouse where all the artists took over, including the Fugs who played, you know, and the group image. I do want to get the group image in here.
Mention the group image. I didn't write enough about them.
The group image were followers of Satchidananda and grass dealers, and they had a storefront on East 6th Street between 2nd Avenue and 1st Avenue. And it was a commune, and they had a band, and it was called the Group Image. And one of the things that we did, I married two of the people from this at a big event at Cheetah, which was a club uptown,
right, which is written about,
which Shirley Clark filmed this marriage, and the wedding party came in on motorcycles, and the unusual thing about this was that Nancy, the bride, was 15 and very, very pregnant, and Artie was a nice Jewish boy from Williamsburg who was 18, and I was a boohoo in the Timothy Leary Church, and functioned. You know, I was legitimately.
Did you have the authority?
Yes, I had legitimate. Yes, I was a legitimate boohoo, and I married them. And at the time, Esquire gave me a Dubious Achievement Award when it was very important to get those kinds of awards. But the group. This is the kind of culture it was. There was a commune. They had a little storefront that sold sort of natural foods, and in the back room sold you pot and tie-dyed shirts and tie-dyed things. And they had the Span, which was sort of like if Frank Zappa had formed a rock band of not very well-trained musicians, it would be the Group Image.
One of the things I like about where we've been going with this conversation, it gives you an idea, actually, from a writer's perspective, how hard it is to kind of rein in your subject matter, because particularly in the 60s, writing about New York City, there was a point that every chapter I was writing seemed to get stuck in 1965, because it was just so much went on, and it was cross-cultural, and it's an important part about important point that I'm trying to make in the book, that none of the music is happening in a vacuum. It's not happening in isolation. It's happening because of what else is happening in the city, whether it's a shift in the economy, whether it's a shift in immigration, whether it's gentrification, whether it's NYU deciding it's got a claim on Washington Square Park, etc., etc., etc. And so, you know, while the rock clubs or the folk clubs,
let's
or the
talk about
dance
the
clubs,
Dom for a moment. Okay.
And then I want to take some questions, because I don't have time. I mentioned the Dom for sure.
The Dom was a club on St. Mark's Place. And one night, Andy and some of the Velvets, I think Lou, maybe John, Nico, and Bridget and Gerard Malanga and Ronnie Catrone and Ingrid Superstar. And, you know, there were sort of names that other generations know, but at the time it was just like, who was in the back room and Max's at a particular time. We wanted to go to see Jackson Browne, because Jackson Browne had been in the restaurant the night before and had picked up a waitress by the name of Tonto, who from Max's, who later became his wife. But someone had said he's really cute, you know. And so we all go over to the Dom to see Jackson Browne perform. And Nico, she got him. She got him. She just got this innocent. I mean, he was so innocent. And she...
Didn't he end up writing most of Chelsea Girls?
Pardon?
Didn't Jackson Browne end up writing a lot of Chelsea Girls?
He wrote some of Chelsea Girl. I don't want to get in trouble with Lou on anything. Okay.
I mean the album, but because I seem to remember that being that after she left the Velvet Underground, Lou and Sterling and John wrote a couple of songs, but that would explain maybe the Jackson Browne connection. But
just to end it, so that night is when Andy and the Velvets and Gerard saw this space on St. Mark's Place, and that's where the idea for the Plastic Inevitable, which was one of the first multimedia performance music presentations that took place in New York City, and that was 1965 or 66.
It was early 66.
66.
Yeah, and it certainly was. And you've got an argument that, you know, you could say as much happened psychedelically, you know, in New York City. And I am going to take some questions here, but, you know, the word psychedelia, the first use I can see of it is on the Holy Modal Rounders track, where Peter Stamford puts the word in because he couldn't hear the word on the original.
Total acid head.
Yes, and actually a total speed freak as well. And the point you made about speed coming into the East Village, Lower East Side, was very evident when I was reading the East Village Other, and the people had told me this, that it went from pot and acid almost overnight to heroin and speed, and the Groovy Murders were right in the middle of that. And make of that what you will, but the scene changed, and a lot of people said that's why I put those murders in there, that the scene changed after those murders and the drugs changed, and I'm sure things didn't come back. I know that we could talk all night, and I think Jim and I probably would, but the Strand would sooner that we didn't, and they would sooner that we kept the thing moving. And I'm really glad they had us here. We have a microphone here. Ariel has a microphone, and we'd be happy to take some questions. There's so many other chapters and genres in the book we didn't cover. This is just like talking about one area downtown and Jim's involvement in it. If anybody would like to ask us anything, Ariel has the mic.
Yeah, just raise your hand, and I can take your questions.
Okay, about a couple of years ago I went to a reading for the book Riot on Sunset Strip, and he talks about how, you know, the scene in Los Angeles and how, you know, what happened there, but a lot of the New York scene actually had to migrate to New York to Los Angeles to happen, and the reasons that the scene in the garage rock and folk rock scenes were actually repressed in New York because of regulations, because you couldn't play in clubs unless you're in the union. There were restrictions on how old you had to be able to actually go in and play as a musician. On the street they had a thing called the organ grinder law, so that you know, folkies couldn't even play on the streets, they'd get busted. And so even the first garage rock record, although there were bands here, was the Standells, who were from Boston. And I'd just like you to talk about how much that kind of like repression repressed the scene in the earlier 60s.
I would say from my end, and obviously not being there, but having studied this a lot, the continual story is the New York City bureaucracy. There's never a moment when it can't invent a law to stop you doing what you want to do. And I mentioned about them closing down the Savoy Ballroom for very spurious reasons in the middle of the war. They introduced cabaret licenses, cabaret taxes. There were at one point in the Jazz Age and during the war, there were 3 different cabaret taxes and laws. Having a cabaret license meant if you got a drug bust, you couldn't perform in a club. That happened to Billie Holiday and Charlie Parker. The basket houses came about because you had to have a license to have a folk musician playing in your club. So the coffee houses got around it by saying, we won't book anybody, we won't advertise them, they can just play and hand around the basket and get paid that way. There was once a folk music riot in Washington Square Park, which I joke about the folk riot on the wording on the headline on the front of the New York Times being an oxymoron, but they had given a license to the